Today, we will be hearing from Mona Khademi. She was born in Tehran, Iran, and received her bachelor's degree from Pahlavi University there. Today, it's called Shiraz University, and then a master's degree from American University in Washington, D.C. She has been working towards a PhD degree at Imperial College London. Since the year 2000, she has been researching about the life of Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney, a very, very prominent early American believer who spent most of her life in Paris and who is particularly known by the Baha'is as the person who compiled the book Some Answered Questions. We will not, however, be talking about Some Answered Questions today because that may be a future webinar topic. She has presented papers on this topic at Baha'i, Iranian, and Middle Eastern Studies conferences, as well as at the Embassy of Latvia in Washington, D.C., and at the Library of Congress. We'll have to hear from her about the Latvians and why they're interested at another point. She has published several papers based on years of research, and the biography that she, of course, is now finishing up, Some Questions Answered, should be out in a matter of months. As an independent researcher, Mona Khademi has presented papers and talks about Baha'i and non-Baha'i topics to Baha'i and non-Baha'i international conferences in Europe and the United States. Several of her papers and the proceedings of the conferences have been published in English and in Persian, and I have a list of various journals there at the end, some of which I probably better not try to pronounce because I can't quite get them right. So, without further time taking us away from the topic today, I want to welcome Mona Khademi for joining us today. And Mona, we very much look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Robert. My gratitude goes to you for this invitation and to the staff of Wilmette Institute, in particular for Nicola and Boyd for their assistance in organizing this event. And thanks to all who are listening today. I am grateful for this opportunity. It is my great honor that during this November, when the Baha'is from around the world are observing the 100-year anniversary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, I am speaking about an early Western believer who was devoted to him. I will talk about Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney, an American woman who at a very young age of 21 heard about Abdu'l-Bahá, a spiritual leader from the East, and visited him in Palestine, accepted the faith that he was promoting, the Baha'i faith, and followed its teachings for the rest of her life. Many of you may know of her greatest achievement, that of compiling Some Answered Questions, which is based on the questions that she posed to Abdu'l-Bahá and his responses. Laura Barney visited him at least 8 times, each time staying from a few days up to several months. She also had the honor of being in his presence in the West. It is interesting to note that she had received at least 26 tablets and letters from Abdu'l-Bahá. Today, I will share with you what attracted her to this faith and its teachings. Why had she traveled to the desolate city of Akká so many times? What were the attributes of Abdu'l-Bahá that she noticed? How did her devotion to Abdu'l-Bahá impact her life? What were some of her accomplishments? I have tried to use the original tablets of Abdu'l-Bahá to her and her own words about him, and have not tried to paraphrase them. Also, in order to save time, I am not going to mention when I'm reading a quote. Laura Clifford Barney was born in 1879 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her family was from Dayton, Ohio, who moved to Cincinnati and later in 1889 to Washington, D.C. Both her mother, Alice Pike Barney, and her father, Albert Clifford Barney, were rich. She was brought up in luxury, had a pampered childhood, and was sent to a boarding school outside of Paris at a young age. Her family were Episcopalians. Laura was studying dramatic arts in Paris in 1900 when she attended a gathering at the home of May Bowles, later Maxwell. That may be the first time she heard about the new faith and became seriously interested. She learned about the teachings of Baha'u'llah and that of his son Abdu'l-Bahá, who was in Akká, Palestine. Laura had been looking for something to wrap her soul around. She sent a letter to Abdu'l-Bahá stating that she wanted to meet him before accepting the teachings of the faith. As soon as she received a reply, she made her first pilgrimage to Haifa in October of 1900. Laura gave a talk 1 year after her first visit and made the following remarks about the details of her visit with the master. Abdu'l-Bahá was known to the Baha'is as the master, Akká. She wrote, I arrived at Haifa and sent this message to the master, that I believe that he must be the Christ spirit of the day, that the whole world was waiting for him, but that I could not feel it, but that if he was the Christ spirit of the day, he, of course, could prove it to me by making me yearn to follow the only path of true self-sacrifice and virtue. I sent this message because I always believe that everything should be based on sincerity, and I do not want to go in an attitude which I did not absolutely feel was mine. We arrived at the humble house of Abbas Effendi, Abdu'l-Bahá, and were sitting with a number of the believers when the master came in. Before he had really entered the room, I was so surprised and overwhelmed by a wonderful atmosphere that I had never felt before. An atmosphere of perfect, complete humility and majesty at that time. The master swept into the room and, bidding us to be seated, began to speak. Of course, I could not understand the tongue in which he spoke, very unfortunately, but the spirit was so strong that went forth that one could follow the words that came to us through the clear translation of Ali Qoli Khan. My eyes that had until then been blinded gradually opened. First, we remained perfectly still. After a while, I felt the tears coming to my eyes and running down my cheeks. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of absolute gratitude, tears that one might shed if one had been locked up in a dark prison for years. It seemed that I had often tried to get out of this darkness that surrounded me, but in vain. So, as I heard the master's words and felt that he was the Christ spirit of the day, my tears continued to flow and my heart to beat with absolute love, absolute hope and happiness. Some years later, she wrote, I think the impression one has of Abdu'l-Bahá is in that it grows gradually and suddenly at the same time. I know when I first had the honor of going to Haifa, at once I was impressed by his sanctity, by his wisdom, his majesty, his humility, by the manifestation of all the great qualities in such a simple, natural way. Then came Laura's second trip to Akká, which took place almost 6 months after her first trip in spring of 1901. Laura's second visit lasted between 10 to 12 days. A newspaper article in the United States reported about her visit to the Holy Land and wrote, Miss Barney's contribution is interesting as showing the attitude of a woman follower of the head of this faith. She is a firm believer in Abbas Effendi, Abdu'l-Bahá, whom she calls a perfect being. In 1902, Laura traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit her mother. Laura may have received the following tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá at that time, excerpt of which is, I beseech God that every instant thou mayest glimpse a fresh light of divine bounty and attract enduring confirmations. O thou beloved maid servant of Baha, I will henceforth address thee as Amatul-Bahá, handmaiden of Baha, to signify that thou hast attained a special rank and that this title will be a crown of beneficence upon thy head, whose gems and pearls will shine forevermore, reflect upon future centuries and ages, and thou wilt know how precious a gift this is. Laura's third visit to Akká was in early 1904 at the master's invitation. She stayed until spring of 1906 with a few short side trips to Egypt. Abdu'l-Bahá was confined to the city of Akká and was permitted to receive only a few visitors. It was during those years that she wrote that Abdu'l-Bahá decided that she should remain in Akká to familiarize herself with the Persian language. From Akká, she wrote to her mother, at present, I do not think I need to leave Akká this fall. The master wishes me to remain to pursue my studies, his teachings and Persian. In another letter to her mother, she stated, the master's life is a marvel to me. Never have I seen such a useful and perfect being. She learned more and more about the faith while in the Holy Land and started posing her questions to Abdu'l-Bahá. He revealed answers to her questions, and she wrote down the answers. Her questions were related to significant matters such as theology, materialism, the reality of spirit, and interpretation of several Bible verses, and many other concepts. Then, late spring of 1906, came Laura's travels to Turkmenistan and Persia, the native land of Baha'u'llah that she was asked by Abdu'l-Bahá to visit. Laura decided to have a male companion, and she decided to travel with Hippolyte Dreyfus. Hippolyte was born in 1873 in Paris. He was the first French man to believe in Baha'u'llah. He had visited Abdu'l-Bahá in 1903. Laura had met him while attending one of May Bolzel's gatherings in Paris. She traveled with Hippolyte and a chaperone, Madame Lachenay. Laura was the first Western Baha'i woman to travel to Persia, today's Iran. I will not be discussing the details of this trip. I will just mention that they first visited the first Mashraq al-Asghar, house of worship in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, before traveling to Iran. This stay lasted for over 2 months. While in Iran, they visited Tehran, Rasht, Qazvin, Isfahan, Kashan, Zanjan, Tabriz, and Maku, and met with many dignitaries and Persian Baha'is. Next picture, please. Then Laura returned to Haifa to report Abdu'l-Bahá right after this trip. She commented, "We couldn't express to Abdu'l-Bahá our deep gratitude at what we had seen and heard. Little by little, we spoke of it." Abdu'l-Bahá wrote a tablet to Sadr al-Sutur after hearing her stories and experiences of her travels. Sadr al-Sutur was a Baha'i scholar whose classes Laura had attended while in Tehran. Abdu'l-Bahá wrote, "Amatul-Bahá, Laura Barney, arrived with supreme glad tidings and eloquent speech, with teary eyes and a heart full of the spirit of joy. Each day and night, praising the friends in Iran and her devotion to that loving friend, Sadr al-Sudur. In truth, she is enthralled with those who have remained steadfast in the covenant and enamored with the pure and noble friends." Soon after Laura's return to Paris from her travels to Middle East, she started working on some unanswered questions. She had received Abdu'l-Bahá's permission to publish it. The master had corrected the Persian draft and then had approved and signed each corrected segment and stamped it with his seal, the same seal that was used for his revealed tablets. I'm not going to discuss the details of how she posed her questions, how notes were taken down, and how they were reviewed. They are covered completely in her biography. However, I wish to share this tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá to her. "I consider you in such high regard that I want you to be happy always and to advance and progress each day so that you may attain to the knowledge of the divine. Thus far, no one has received this favor whereby such lessons were dictated and transcribed. You are the only one who has attained to such a bounty. This bounty will be eternal. Therefore, be thankful to God and remain in utter happiness and joy." The book that she compiled, Some Answered Questions, collected and translated from the Persian of Abdu'l-Bahá by Laura Clifford-Barney, was published in 1908. In addition, the Persian edition was titled An-Nur al-Abha fi Mufawazat Abdu'l-Bahá, and the French translation, Les Leçons de Saint-Jean d'Acre, which was carried out mostly by Hippolyte, were both published that same year. Laura gave a talk in the United States in 1909, and she covered many aspects of her life in Akká and her observations of Abdu'l-Bahā's characteristics and attributes. She said, "It is not what I think is of much importance, but what I saw and such incidents as came to my notice and of the characteristics and habits of Abdu'l-Bahá." She continued, "All around the surrounding country of Akká, he is known as Abbas Effendi. They look upon him as a very wise man, likening him to Solomon. They come to him for advice, and many difficult questions are put before him for solution. He is felt to be a wise and remarkable saint. He is extraordinary in his dealings with the poor, being their best friend." She continued, "Above all, I have seen the master day in, day out, unfaltering and joyous in his mission of education and love. As the center of the covenant, his station is humility. He would be a brilliant being in any walk of life and would have made a success in any walk of life because he depends wholly upon that force which is of God." Laura found his teaching style to be simple yet mystical. His straightforward way of expressing a concept would coalesce with the listener's inner being. She wrote, "It is difficult to condense into words the volume of force that radiated from his teachings. He spoke simply, and his sentences became a part of one's inner thoughts, seeking a worthy outlet in action." 7 decades later, she shared about her early experiences of meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. She said, "There was only one thing that she wished to say, and this was, the whole life of Abdu'l-Bahá radiated encouragement and spirituality to all those with whom he came in contact, be they high personages or be they the simple poor people he might meet in the street." It is important to learn how Laura reflected on her conversion. 9 years after learning about the Baha'i faith, Laura wrote a letter to a Baha'i friend about it. She summarized what she had experienced in France, England, America, Egypt, Russia, and Persia, and how she had seen the Baha'i faith broaden the minds and uplift the hearts of men. Then she continued, "In Akká, I have witnessed that guidance and information radiate from that center to the world at large. I have never seen a simple man, through the assistance of God, closely in touch with the innermost lives of millions of fellow beings. In here, I have seen the guidance of servitude and love." Laura continued her correspondence with Abdu'l-Bahá and received many tablets from him. Laura and Clifford Dreyfus were married in 1911. They adopted the last name of Dreyfus-Barney after their marriage. She had known him for 11 years. It was through their collaborations on the translations of some answered questions and their travels together that they realized how well they were matched. Laura may have asked Abdu'l-Bahá about marriage and questioned if marriage would interfere with her activities and service, because Abdu'l-Bahá sent her a tablet and mentioning the importance of service to the cause of God, as well as the importance of marriage. He stated, "This teaching and service doth not preclude marriage. Thou canst take unto thyself a husband, at the same time serve the cause of God. The one doth not preclude the other." The newlyweds received another tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá after he received the news of their union. "Your joyous and delightful letter just arrived. In the divine kingdom, you both are considered as the denizen of nearness and in the sight of Abdu'l-Bahá, much esteemed. Thus, what could be better for you two than to be married and in doing so become as one and establish a generation of Baha'is in Paris and bring joy and happiness to all." A few months after her marriage, Laura was awaiting the arrival of the master in Europe. She had a major role in Abdu'l-Bahá's journey to the West. She had invited Abdu'l-Bahá to visit Europe several times. He had traveled to Egypt in 1910. In an undated letter to Laura, perhaps that same year, he stated, "I had not given the idea of a journey to Europe much thought, as it was more likely for me to first travel to Egypt. However, in order to meet you, Shomaha," meaning Laura and Hippolyte, "I decided to travel to Europe. I am hoping to reach Paris shortly." Abdu'l-Bahá embarked on his journey to Europe in August 1911. When he arrived in Thonon-les-Bains, France, that August, Laura was already there to welcome him. Laura and her husband were his constant companions. They stayed at the Grand Hotel du Parc, the same hotel in which Abdu'l-Bahá was staying. Together with Julia Thompson, who had joined them in Thonon, they were either in Abdu'l-Bahá's room or he was in their rooms, in the most charming informality. They accompanied the master on an automobile ride and drove to a country inn. When Abdu'l-Bahá had his next stop for 29 days in Great Britain, Laura and her husband went to assist him with translations. Lady Blomfield wrote, "Foremost amongst our visitors were Monsieur and Madame Dreyfus-Barney, the brilliant French scholar and his no less brilliant American wife, who spoke Persian with Abdu'l-Bahá, translated for him, and were altogether helpful, courteous, and charming." After London, Abdu'l-Bahá returned to France and went to Paris, in October 1911. Next slide, please. He may have stayed with Laura and her husband for a few days before moving to an apartment at 4 Avenue du Camoin that they found and rented for him. Abdu'l-Bahá spent a good deal of time at the home of Dreyfus-Barney's, which was not far from his apartment. Laura and Hippolyte again served as interpreters for him and for several other people. Laura translated Abdu'l-Bahá's addresses from Persian into English. The Dreyfus-Barneys held the last meeting in Paris for Abdu'l-Bahá at their home before he returned to Egypt that December. During his stay in Paris, Abdu'l-Bahá attended and spoke at many gatherings. His words and exhortations were written down by several people. It was through the efforts of Laura and a few others that his addresses in 1911 were published in English under the title Talks of Abdu'l-Bahá given in Paris, later known as Paris Talks. Then came Abdu'l-Bahá's journey to United States, to North America, that started in April of 1912. Laura wrote that she had the honor of gaining his presence during this visit, as did her husband. During the month of May in Washington, D.C. She was with Abdu'l-Bahá when he addressed a group of women and then visited Neighborhood House, a home for the poor that had been established through the efforts of Laura's mother. While Abdu'l-Bahá and his entourage were traveling across the country, United States, Hippolyte received a letter from him that stated, "I hope both you and the maidservant of Bahá, Laura Barney, will be able to render important services on this journey and will welcome the cause of proclaiming the word of God. Convey my respectful greetings to the maidservant of Bahá. I pray God for confirmations and assistance for her." When Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to England after his 8-month tour of North America in December of 1912, Laura joined him in London. Laura wrote that when the master visited Europe, I again gained admittance to his presence. Abdu'l-Bahá's next stop was back in Paris, and Laura and her husband again hosted him. They were in constant touch with their special guest. They accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá to meetings and organized significant gatherings for him in their home. They also invited Persian dignitaries to meet with him. They drove him to historical places in and around Paris, such as Versailles, and arranged for a visit to the Louvre Museum. The Dreyfus-Barneys drove the master to the train station in their car and bid farewell to this special guest, June of 1913. The next time they were able to be with Abdu'l-Bahá was after World War I in 1919, when they went to the Holy Land. They were the first pilgrims to arrive from the West after the war. In a letter, Abdu'l-Bahá stated that it is highly opportune, and our part, we await your arrival. Shoghi Effendi, whom Laura knew since his childhood, personally welcomed them at the train station in Haifa and took them straight away to the house of Abdu'l-Bahá, where they would be staying. the master arrived a few minutes later. Shoghi Effendi wrote about them. Oh, how glad and grateful they were to meet him, to speak to him, to hear his voice, to sit beside him, and to feel the touch of his hand. All the friends gathered that evening at the request of Abdu'l-Bahá to welcome them. The next afternoon, Laura and Hippolyte had a few of the friends went to the middle room of the shrine of the Bab, and Abdu'l-Bahá joined them. He gave a talk, and later they all entered the interior of the tomb, and according to Shoghi Effendi, most ardent and inspiring prayers of praise and thanksgiving was offered on the whole, as Mrs. Dreyfus intimated it was a very lovely and spiritual meeting. Soon after Laura and Hippolyte left the Holy Land, Shoghi Effendi sent a letter to Laura. He wrote, "Dear Laura Khanum, now we miss you these days. Tenderly remember the happy days you spent amidst us in the presence of the beloved." That June, Laura received a tablet from Abdu'l-Bahá expressing appreciation for her services. He wrote, "Your services are gratifying and acclaimed, and your hardships and ordeals are noted and recognized. I beseech divine bounties that, like unto a lighted candle, you may light up every assembly, present eloquent speeches and stirring utterances, and with the power of kingdom cause joy and excitement in the heart of the audience." In 1920, Laura and Hippolyte finally started on the journey to the Far East that they had been forced to cut short at the onset of World War I. They had started on that journey around the world in accordance with the wishes of Abdu'l-Bahá in 1914. He had encouraged them to travel to China, Korea, Japan, India, and other Asian countries, and possibly return to Iran, but could not complete that journey since World War I had started. Now, in the fall of 1920, on their way, they visited Abdu'l-Bahá for a week again. Laura spent much time with him on this visit to discuss social issues. Laura told her sister that their visit with Abdu'l-Bahá had been delightful. The itinerary of their second journey to the Far East included traveling to Indochina, Singapore, Burma, southern China, and India. They embarked on this journey and visited the cultural and historical sites in different countries and met with dignitaries. It was in Rangoon that Laura heard the news of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. This news was devastating and shocking for Laura, who had spent months close to the master in Palestine, Europe, and the United States. She expressed her feelings in these words: "The master has departed, finished the bodily link, finished the possibility of going into his presence, of hearing his living voice, foreseeing his thoughtful eyes, finished the expression of love, energy, and patience that was personified in his form. To be with him now, we must turn to our own hearts. we must turn to our memory. We must turn to his written words, and we must fit ourselves to commute with his spirit. The impulse to follow him was irresistible, to leave behind the triteness of earth. But he has told us not to keep for ourselves alone what he has entrusted to us for humanity. Laura reflected on the master's passing. How vast is our inheritance, not hearsay and legends, but the written word, and the stress that the master has put on unity gives us the key to all things. After hearing this sad news, the Dreyfus-Barneys decided to shorten the trip and to join the Holy Family because Abdu'l-Bahá's family missed having them near. It was after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá that Shoghi Effendi invited several capable and experienced Baha'is, including Laura and Hippolyte, to Haifa to consult on the future of the Baha'i faith in February of 1922. It must have been consoling to Laura and Hippolyte to be with Shoghi Effendi and to be among these Western Baha'is, the majority of whom were close friends who had gathered in Haifa. Upon arrival, Laura wrote, "In the folds of this gentle mountain lies the body of my best friend and counselor, the Master." She also wrote to her sister that the Master's family was filling the great vacancy left in their lives by continual activity in carrying out his wishes. Several years after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, Laura wrote an article in which she expressed her deep feelings about her remembrance of Abdu'l-Bahá. She wrote, "I would like sometime to step out of the world of my present life to describe how Abdu'l-Bahá appeared to me as I observed his majestic, sensitive beauty, his life, active and human, forceful and inspired. Without doubt, he knew beyond the present. The wise man sees the tree in the seed." Abdu'l-Bahá spoke also of another time when the mind and the heart, united, should establish true civilization. In her later years, Laura was always nostalgic about her visits and pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She reminisced about her early visits to Akká. "What wonderful days were those when I was in Akká and Haifa with the Master and the family." She was fully aware of the significance of her stays in the Holy Land. Unfortunately, because of poor health, she wasn't able to return despite her wishes. Her earthly life came to an end at the age of 94 in August of 1974. She was buried in the Passy Cemetery in Paris. She had requested that she be buried in the same plot as her sister Natalie. Her wishes to have a simple Baha'i service were respected. The death of Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney was widely reported in French and English newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. An appreciative cable message was sent by the Universal House of Justice to the National Assembly of France, recognizing her outstanding achievements during the heroic age of the faith. Hugo Giaccheri, who had known Laura for many years, wrote the following tribute. Her enthusiasm for this ideal, improving human relations, bringing together peoples of different races, classes, and nations, never lessened. Those who had the rare privilege of knowing her over a period of many decades can testify that her undaunted zeal for the objective of the brotherhood of man remained alive and glowing to the very last day of her life on earth. Let us now talk about Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney's numerous achievements. She had heard Abdu'l-Bahá state that we are not to keep for ourselves alone what he had entrusted to us for humanity. It was in following this advice that she devoted her life to implementing into action the principles that she had believed in with an outward-looking approach. The emphasis of the Baha'i faith and its teachings on the eradication of prejudice, the unity of the races, the rights of women, the brotherhood of all mankind, the universal peace must have appealed strongly to her. She devoted her life to the promotion of these ideals and these social causes. She became active with many progressive movements, with platforms that incorporated the Baha'i teachings. After World War I, Laura became interested in the League of Nations. The League was the first international intergovernmental organization whose principal mission was the maintenance of world peace and its social and humanitarian principles aligned with her own. Next slide, please. Another organization that attracted Laura to its goals was the International Council of Women. And since its inception, the Council's aims have been consistent: the unification of women's organizations for action to promote human rights, sexual equality, peace, and women's involvement in the international sphere. Next slide, please. All these were dear to Laura's heart. She became the council representative to the League of Nations and played important roles in different capacities. Laura worked tirelessly to increase the influence of women in international affairs and to assist persons in diplomatic and government circles to understand how feminine values could advance the cause of peace. She once had said that her activities with the International Council of Women were motivated by its goals, as earlier advanced by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Laura organized a conference under the auspices of the League of Nations in Rome in 1934 that Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy at the time, attended. He and some other dignitaries spoke at the inaugural meeting of the Congress. Laura, who was a brilliant speaker, emphasized the importance of international peace in her talks during extensive travels around the world, which included traveling across Canada in 1932, and travels to several Middle Eastern countries in 1935. She was awarded the Chevalier of Honors in 1923-25 and was promoted to the ranks of the officer in the French Legion of Honor in 1937. As an American citizen, she had to leave Paris at the onset of World War I. After her return to Paris at the end of the war in 1946, Laura continued her work under the auspices of the United Nations. She was happy to see the teachings of her faith materializing through the work of the UN and UNESCO, helping to bring world consciousness to the importance of education and brotherhood throughout all the continents. This was the story of Laura Barney and her meetings with Abdu'l-Bahá, and details of some of her accomplishments. Perhaps it was after meeting Abdu'l-Bahá that she found the path of service, which she followed for the rest of her life. She had accepted the teachings of the Baha'i faith and became devoted to the person of Abdu'l-Bahá. It was his attributes that had attracted her. Laura opened her heart and mind to him and became his disciple. As we know, her most important achievement was some unanswered questions. It was her greatest service to her faith, a memento for future generations, a significant book from the utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá. This book is an authoritative repository of Abdu'l-Bahā's profound insight. Not only was this book of momentous importance at the time of its publication, but it has continued to be so over a century after its publication. Some Answered Questions is the only work to be considered part of the sacred writings of the Baha'i faith that was not written by one of its central figures. The hope and happiness that Laura Barney found after meeting Abdu'l-Bahá and hearing his words stayed with her for the rest of her life. She became both practical and spiritual. She always remembered that Abdu'l-Bahá had told her to seek worthy outlets in all her actions. Laura truly believed that it was only through action that she could be nearer to the beloved. She always remembered that he had also advised her and those near him not to keep for ourselves alone what he has entrusted to us for humanity. Abdu'l-Bahá had noticed Laura's capacity and given her many responsibilities. He nurtured this brilliant woman, trained her at a young age, and had prayed God for confirmations and assistance for her. He had stated to her that she was the only one who attained to such a bounty. Abdu'l-Bahá replied to a question of how to be a Baha'i. He responded, "To be a Baha'i simply means to love all the world, to love humanity, and try to serve it, to work for universal peace and universal brotherhood." Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney followed Abdu'l-Bahā's advice. As promised by Abdu'l-Bahá, she received heavenly blessings. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was very moving and very inspiring. And it occurs to me as an interesting question to ask you. I can only think of one other person, and I'm not sure even of that person, who, as a Westerner, spent so much time with the master and was so close to the master. And that person I'm thinking of is Lua Getzinger. I can't think of anyone else other than these two women who spent months, years in the presence of the master, Westerners. Can you?
You know, I haven't researched about others. During her stay of 1904 to 1906, that's 2.5 years.
Really?
She went on 2 short trips to Egypt, but the rest of the time she was with Abdu'l-Bahá. So that's almost 2.5 years. And
Wow.
besides that, I think she has visited the Holy Land at least 8 times. She was with Abdu'l-Bahá in Paris and in Thonon and in Washington. And we know that Abdu'l-Bahá stayed the longest in Paris than any other city in the Western world. So yeah. I don't know of anybody else. I haven't studied anybody else, but I think she may be the only one.
I mean, this tells you something, and this is an incredible privilege that she had, and an incredible recognition by Abdu'l-Bahá of her capacities, it seems to me. You know, we talk a lot about accompaniment now. Abdu'l-Bahá accompanied people this way. And she may have been the person in the Western world who was accompanied by Abdu'l-Bahá the most. And that's I think, really my big takeaway from this talk. I mean, to think what that means. Think what that means, and the resulting services that she was able to perform because of this love and attention and advice and prayers that he showered on her.
And perhaps she was, not perhaps, I'm sure she was very intelligent and bright and brilliant. And Abdu'l-Bahá saw that potential in her. As we know, when she first went to the Holy Land, she was 21 years old.
Wow.
And the next year, she was 21 and a half. And when she compiled some answered questions, she was 29. So that says a lot about her. That already says a lot about her. And Abdu'l-Bahá had seen her potential and her capability and had invested in her and trained her.
Yeah, I think that's very clear, and that's really, I think that to me, that amazes me. And there's so many details of her life. I'd love to ask you questions, and of course, our audience has questions too, and I don't want to forget them. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the book. Some questions answered: the life of Laura Barney. I understand it's thorough and lengthy and exhaustively and exhaustingly researched.
Yes, to all your questions and comments. I have been researching about her life since the year 2000. And if I haven't been pushed or encouraged by some people, I would have liked to continue researching. But a friend suggested to me some years ago that you need to stop and you need to write. So I did stop. I didn't stop, actually. I continued researching, but I started to write. And the book is to be published by George Ronald, hopefully very soon. It's getting its last few edits and cover and indexing. And I hope your audience, your participants of Wilmette could look for, if interested, look for it under in Europe under George Ronald, or in the US soon, Baha'i Distribution Service. It's her full biography. As I said, she had a long life. She lived 94 years. And she had many humanitarian activities. I have researched about all of those. It's about her Baha'i activities. It's about her non-Baha'i activities. It's about her life in general. It has interesting characters of her family. Some people may know her mother, who was an artist, who also had the privilege of spending a month in Akká near Abdu'l-Bahá, and her sister, who had met Abdu'l-Bahá in Paris and in London. So it's an interesting book. It will cater to different groups, both Baha'is and non-Baha'is, and they can select whatever part they like to read about it. And I have, as I said, I've been writing for the past few years, and I kept on asking my editor to add few more information as I came across them, as recent as perhaps a month ago.
Well, one more question before we get to the questions from the audience, because they're asking a lot of questions. I think while Abdu'l-Bahá was accompanying Laura Clifford Barney in her personal development, I think you could say that Laura Clifford Barney was accompanying you.
She did.
Tell us about that. How has it changed you? How's it affected you? What's your personal takeaway?
You know, when I was researching, I lived in two different worlds. I was living now, and I was transferred in her time. Everything of that period became fascinating for me. I have tried to visit many of the places that she has traveled to. I went to Egypt to see the hotel where she stayed.
Wow.
I have been to Thonon-les-Bains. I plan to go to Mont Saint-Pellerin, where her husband had a house. I have visited the United Nations, the picture I showed, the League of Nations building in Geneva, and it has become fascinating for me to be wherever she had gone to. So I was transformed to her era. And I played her role in one movie that was made of her.
Oh, that's good. That would be quite a lot of fun, I'm sure, too. Well, one person asks, could you comment on the Barney family as a whole? Also read book on Laura's sister, Natalie, but this unique family seems to all have some capacity of some sort, Alice especially, and what about the father? So could you talk about them?
For further detail, I refer you to her biography. I have covered the mother, the father, and Natalie to the extent that they have impacted Laura's life in my book. But some general background, her father was a very well-to-do, I don't know whether we can call him industrialist, a businessman. Her mother was an artist, a philanthropist, choreographer, playwright. She was a very talented woman. And her sister was Natalie Barney, who was 3 years older. She was a literary person in Paris. She held famous salons in Paris for about 60 years with the prominent authors and significant people of Paris attending her salons regularly. I don't know what the question was in regard to the Red Book.
No, a book that was read. Maybe he read a book about Laura's sister Natalie. Maybe yes. That's what he means.
Actually, there are several biographies of Natalie's life. There is one major biography of Laura's mother life. Wow. Several articles, but besides this biography of hers that I have researched, there is nothing major about Laura. There are few articles, but nothing major about Laura. So this is a first for her.
Another question about May Bowles. Didn't May Bowles also introduce the faith to Thomas Breakwell? And I believe that's true from what I remember.
I think so too.
Yeah. One person says fabulous presentation. Another one says so informative and inspiring. Heartfelt gratitude. Another person says, thank you so much for such a well-organized and inspiring introduction to such an important figure about whom I had known nothing. Obviously, years of immaculate, detailed research and methodical organization and presentation. Mona Khademi is a great historian and tells a great story. Bravo.
Thank you. I don't consider myself historian. I call myself an independent researcher.
Well, you're a historian. Once it's published, you're definitely a historian. No one can question it at that point. That's always the way it is. Thank you so much for this. Can you talk a bit more about the marriage of Hippolyte and Laura? And where can we find the tablet that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote to them, please?
I don't know what else I can tell about their marriage. They were married in Paris in April of 1911. Something interesting I can say is actually the tablet is in the book. And something interesting I can say is that same day, Laura's mother was getting married for a second time, and she had asked Laura to be married the same day in Paris. So they had a double marriage in Paris, and Laura, being an obedient daughter, accepted. Hippolyte accepted too. So her mother got married the same day as Laura and her husband in Paris in April of 1911.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. He passed away much sooner than she did, Hippolyte. He passed away in the 30s, it seems to me.
Hippolyte was 3 or 4 years Laura's senior. He passed away in 1928 of some health problems that he had. He had been suffering from some health issues. A year prior to that year, he went to hospital, he had a surgery, he came back, and they were hoping that he would recover, but he did not. He passed away in 1928.
Mm-hmm. And he's buried in Père Lachaise in Paris, if I recall. I've actually been to the family crypt, I'm not sure what you call it, where they have little boxes for the remains of people inside. We could look in and see.
Hippolyte is buried with his family, yes.
Yeah, the Dreyfus-Cardozos. Was the father a Baha'i? He passed away before then, I guess, didn't he?
All his family members were Baha'is. His mother, his father, and his sister, they all became Baha'is.
Dreyfus.
Hippolyte Dreyfus, yes.
Yeah, but I'm asking in this case about Laura. Natalie wasn't a Baha'i, and the father, Laura's and Natalie's father, passed away before she became a Baha'i, right?
Laura went to Haifa in 1900. Her father passed away in 1902.
Oh.
He knew about her converting. She had invited Abul-Faza'el to France and United States and in Washington. So Abul-Faza'el, he had met Abul-Faza'el also. He died in 1902. No, he was not a Baha'i, and he wasn't for her the conversion of her daughter either.
He wasn't in favor, you say?
No.
Interesting. And when did Alice become a Baha'i? Do we know the year?
You know, most probably, that's a very good question. Most probably around the same time as Laura. She was a friend of Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst has a home in Paris and had a home in Washington, D.C. Laura's mother was in Washington, D.C., and she spent a lot of time in Paris. So it's possible that Laura's mother had heard from Phoebe or maybe she heard from Laura in 1900, or maybe a year before that from Phoebe.
It's interesting. Someone asks, why are you so interested and fascinated by Laura instead of other famous women in the faith?
Very good question. You know, when I first started my research, I didn't think I would spend 21 years researching and writing and talking about this woman. She fascinated me as I said at the beginning, I didn't know, but I was inspired by her discipline, by her hard work, by her organization. You know, if it's not because I was, the reason I started was that I couldn't find much about her. So that was the beginning. But the fact that I continued was that she was very disciplined. She was a hard worker. And, you know, she was very organized. I shouldn't say she made life easy for me, but she kept all her correspondences. She kept a copy of every letter she sent. She kept the envelopes that she received. She kept the invitations that she received. She kept everything, which I like and I admire. So, and then reading her writings, after a few years, I became accustomed to her writing. I could read them, not always easily, but then whatever she wrote, it was easy to follow. It was easy, it was meaningful. I enjoyed reading her writing. She was an excellent writer. She could have been a great author. She was very literary. She could express herself very well. And so all those correspondences helped me. And I never got tired of researching about her. So her life became my passion.
Of course. A question from the social media: did Laura also know Arabic?
I don't know how to answer. I have not seen any of her letters in Persian to see how much Arabic she used, but probably she knew a little. Yeah. I think she started learning Persian from Abdu'l-Bahá in Egypt, and she has traveled a lot to Egypt. She has spent months and weeks in Egypt, and then probably she knew a little. If she had learned Persian, most probably she knew a little, and then the fact that her husband knew Arabic and Persian, maybe that had some impact on her. Maybe she had learned some. I don't think she was fluent in Arabic, but perhaps she knew a little.
Sure. Well, if she helped to translate some answered questions into English, she had to have known some Arabic, because the Persian vocabulary that Abdu'l-Bahá was using would have been filled with Arabic words, the technical terms and all that. So she must have known that much Arabic, at least, maybe not the grammar as well. Not to mention walking around Akká and hearing Arabic.
Yeah.
So yeah, she must have known some. Did she do a lot of translating services with people who received tablets from Abdu'l-Bahá? Another question.
She translated a lot of tablets, but I don't know who had sent them tablets. She had helped with translation of tablets. Yes, she did.
And did she translate any books by Abdu'l-Bahá at any point? I don't know. Abdu'l-Bahá didn't actually write books, so I'm not sure if that's quite a clear question.
No, I don't. I haven't come across any books that she translated, but she wrote a lot of articles for different institutions, for example, for Encyclopedia Islamic, Encyclopedia Islamic. She wrote several articles. She wrote articles, but I don't think she has translated any books of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Mm-hmm. What was Natalie's attitude towards the faith? Someone asked whether she was a Baha'i, but I think that's a more interesting question. What did she think of the faith?
That's a different session by itself. I recently gave a talk at the Baha'i Society of Oxford last August, which focused only on that part of Laura's life. Laura and Natalie's meeting with Abdu'l-Bahá and the inspirations. I don't think she was religious in any way. She met Abdu'l-Bahá in London, and they are tablets of Abdu'l-Bahá to her, and Abdu'l-Bahá mentions her in many of his tablets to Laura Barney, but I don't think Natalie would have ever become not only Baha'i, but any other religion. She wasn't a believer in God.
The two sisters were very close. I guess that's very true. Can you elaborate on that?
That's a good question too. They were very close. When I started writing her biography, it wasn't my intention to cover Natalie, because usually the biography of a person doesn't involve the siblings. But in the case of Laura, it was very different. She was very close to her sister. The fact that neither of them had any children, the fact that they were the only two family members living in Paris, the fact that they were both single. Laura had a husband from 1911 to 28 for
17 years,
17 years. The rest of the time she was on her own, and she lived in Paris. So was Natalie. And even though they had come two completely different paths in life, they were the closest sisters, and mostly from Laura's side to Natalie. I can't say it was the same from Natalie's side to Laura, but definitely Laura was devoted to her older sister.
Oh, interesting. Where are the Laura Clifford Barney archives located? That's another question someone asked.
In my office.
No, where her personal papers? You have her personal papers, or they're not in an archive somewhere?
They are. Actually, I have copies of them are in my office.
Of course.
I have researched at several archives. I have researched at the archives of United Nations in Geneva.
Wow.
I have researched at the Baha'i archives in Paris. I have researched at the non-Baha'i, at Natalie Barney's archives in Paris. I have researched at London School of Economics archives, the National Baha'i Archives in United States, archives in Dayton, Ohio, the Washington, D.C. Baha'i archives.
They're everywhere.
I remember.
Well, it's quite a blessing that you've been able to pull things together from so many places now. That's itself an important scholarly achievement for the future. So
I have also interviewed several people, 7 or 8 people who had met Laura Barney. So some of those interviews are in the book.
Let's see. One person just asked this question. What did Laura do when she was in Egypt?
Whenever she went to the Holy Land, they had to travel by sail to Port Said. From Port Said, they would either go, she usually went to Cairo. I don't know what she did the first few times, but she traveled to Egypt several times to give talks. And she was invited, when I mentioned that she traveled to Middle East, that during that trip in 1935, she traveled to Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Syria, and Lebanon. And she was invited to give talks at the national libraries or the universities or very important societies on behalf of the International Council of Women. And at that time, it was, I suppose, League of Nations still.
Can you mention any famous French authors or thinkers that she met? Presumably she met some if she attended Natalie's salon, but I suppose she met them in other places as well.
Yes, I'm sure she met many people. I'm sure she attended many of Natalie's salons because they were happening every Friday night. From top of my mind, I don't remember, but yes, she did meet some important people. I don't remember them now. If that person, they are all in the book with exact references.
Sure, of course. And she must have given talks both in English and in French, presumably. Her French must have been fluent.
Yes. There is a newspaper article, and the reporter says that you could not tell that this is not a French woman speaking. She had no accent.
Phew. Someone just put down here in the notes, Proust, Wilde, and Apollinaire as people she might have met. And one person says, what's your next research topic?
I have spent 20 years researching about her life. I have given talks in general about her life. I have written a full biography. Now I have some side stories. I have a lot of material about her. The next, it's not a project, it's in the same line. I want to write an article or a talk or a little book about her relationship with Shoghi Effendi. She knew Shoghi Effendi from the age of 4 or 5, and they were very close, and she did a lot for Shoghi Effendi. She saw him grow up. She saw him in Paris. She saw him on his way to Oxford. She saw him being married to the daughter of her spiritual mother. And she saw him become the guardian, and they corresponded. So I'm interested to go back and look at those correspondences and write about it. And also include May Bowles, who is Laura's spiritual mother, and Mary Maxwell, who later became Ruhiya Khanum, who Laura knew as a little girl, and then as Abdu'l-Bahá Ruhiya Khanum. So I have some side projects that I would like to work on.
Yeah, it sounds like you have quite a few little, shall we call them loose ends, that you could, and that one is marvelous. That would be fantastic to see.
I have about 20 folders on my desktop with different top titles for different little projects based on her life, but interesting other people.
Well, perhaps in 2023 or so, we could have you come back and talk about her and Shoghi Effendi, because I think that would be a marvelous topic. One person writes, I'm a recent friend of the faith and learning more each day on my journey. Mrs. Khademi speaks of Abdu'l-Bahá writing tablets. How does one define the writing of a tablet rather than a letter?
Very good question. The simple way I can explain, I think it's out of courtesy. We call Abdu'l-Bahá's letters tablets. I personally, in my book, whenever it's very personal, I have called them letters. If it's asking about Laura's mother, giving greetings to your sister, something very specific and related to Laura, I have called them letters. But if they are more significant, I mean, all of them are significant, but we usually call the letters of Abdu'l-Bahá tablets in the Baha'i faith. If Robert, you have a better explanation, please do so.
I like that very much. I mean, normally we call them tablets all the time, but I like the distinction that you've made, that the really personal, shall we say, the more intimate ones, the word letter carries something that the word tablet doesn't. And I think that's a very nice, a nice usage of the term. I think I agree with you. I like that. I like that very much. What was the other thing? What do you think of the new translation of Some Answered Questions? Someone wrote.
I think I'm not going to say what I think about the new translation, but in the talk that I will give about Some Answered Questions, I will go over the different steps while Laura was alive with the reprinting and new editions of Some Answered Questions. So I have no answer to that question at this time.
But it's a good foretaste for a future talk, because you and I have talked about the idea of you coming back perhaps next year in 2022 and giving another presentation so that we can hear a little more about the topic of Laura Barney and the contributions that she's made to the Baha'i faith. I think we're pretty much at the end of our questions, and we've had a very good run of half an hour of questions too. So,
Robert, you asked at the beginning, what was the significance or interest of the Latvian embassy in Laura?
Yes. Tell us.
Laura's mother built a house in Washington, D.C. in 1901. And the building is not very far from my home. And that's where I went in the year 2000 because it was being sold. It was Laura's, Alice Pike Barney's home. And she died in 1931. The two daughters inherited the house. They kept it and rented it out for several years. Then in 1960, they donated the house, which is called Studio House, to Smithsonian Institution for cultural programs. Smithsonian Institution was the owner of the house until the year 2000. Then the upkeep of the house was too much, so they decided to sell it. It changed hands a few times in a matter of a year or two. Then finally, the government of the Republic of Latvia purchased the house. And it's a historical house that cannot be touched. They have to keep the exterior and the interior of the house the way it is. It has a plaque with the name of Alice Pike Barney and the fact that the daughters donated the house to Smithsonian in 1960 on the house. So the Embassy of Latvia invited me to give a talk about the history of the house. So Fantastic. That was their interest in Laura Barney and her family.
Fantastic. And I assume it no longer has that statue out front that people commented about 100 years ago.
It's not in front, but it's in the back of the house, the back of the building.
That supposedly looks like Natalie, I'm told.
It's actually neither of them. You need to read the book, Robert.
Okay, I'm looking forward to the book. Well, thank you so much, Mona, for this marvelous presentation. Our audience clearly really enjoyed it. They asked lots of very interesting questions, and we've all been enriched very much by this chance to look into Laura Clifford Dreyfus-Barney's life and her relationship to Abdu'l-Bahá, which was a truly remarkable relationship as well. So again, thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everybody again in December, when we will have two presentations about Abdu'l-Bahá. Angie Allen will be talking about the funeral of Abdu'l-Bahá, and then we have another presentation. I'm trying to think when that one is, where I think that's the one in January, when she will be talking about the reading of the Old Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. So we have quite a series of presentations coming up on Abdu'l-Bahá as we near the centenary of his passing. And of course, this presentation was part of that as well. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and have a good day.